We're moving through Matthew gradually. Talk some about this king who gave the feast, who invited the ones to come in. This king, of course, being God, his son being Jesus. The ones he invited to come in the first time would have been the Jews. The slaves were those prophets and people he sent out to them to bring them in that they refused to listen to. But because of their refusal, he gave it to someone else, right? Which in this story would be us. The ones he invited, it says in 8, were not worthy. So because they didn't come, because they rejected him, rejected what he had, they weren't worthy to be in that feast. So they went out, right? But probably the most interesting part of this whole parable is this idea that they gathered together the evil and the good, right? You know, and the Bible talks a lot about this, doesn't it? Jesus talks a lot about this in parables. The idea of the good and the evil being together. We talk about the parable of the wheat and the tares, right? Talk about the parable of the sower. Talk about these other things where Jesus talks about the good and the evil existing together, right? And in this case, they were all invited. You see that? They weren't left out. They didn't go out and say, oh, well, you know, you're not good enough to come, but you can come. This was an open invitation to everyone. This is a really big thing in this idea in the Bible, in this idea of what Jesus was doing. Because it leads you into 11, right? It leads you into 11. This is probably the hardest part of this whole thing is 11, right? The guy who was not dressed. What does that mean? You know, what are we, and this whole story that's going on, we understand the story makes a lot of sense. You know, the Jews rejected him, so he went out and he brought in the Gentiles. He invited the evil and the good. That's biblical, right? Calls all men, brought them all in, but then this one guy, he wasn't dressed. What's the significance? He's in the feast, right? What's the feast here, do you think? What is this wedding feast that they're in? Is this heaven, you think? Is this like just maybe people entering into the kingdom? Like, you know, what's the feast? What's the feast? Church, right? Yeah, so it was a choice. Those clothes would have been there. It's like going to a restaurant where they require a suit or require a tie, and if you don't have one, they give you one. You know, it's kind of that idea, you know. He could have chose to do it, but he didn't do it. He refused to do what was required to be at that feast, right? He wasn't dressed. So in this parable, this feast is the church. This is the wedding hall. When do you have the meal in a wedding, right? When do you have the meal? After the wedding, right? So this is the church. This is after the fact. And at this point then, so this guy, this is what really is fascinating about it. So if this is the church and this dinner, this feast is the kingdom, let's use that word, the church, the kingdom. And then at this point, he went in to this guy, and this guy wasn't dressed. So how was he there? You know, I mean, how was he in the kingdom? How was he in this feast if he had never got dressed? How was he even part of this, you know? How was he even part of this deal? You ever thought about that? Heaven has a dress code. Yeah, sure. He invites everyone. Yeah. Is there a clothes? Is there a dress code? Buck said it, right? There's a dress code in heaven. Right? Yeah. Galatians 3 says when we're baptized into Christ, right? We're what? We're clothed with Christ, right? There's a dress code in heaven. There's a way to be dressed. And it's our choice. It's our decision whether or not we do it. God invites all people to be part of the kingdom. But there's a choice to be made. And in this particular parable, this individual always thought it was interesting. It's a man. You know, he invited all these evil, right? So the good and the evil. So you think, well, there's got to be a lot of people there. But it's this one guy, right? This one man. Isn't that interesting, the personal way of the one thing of this? He saw that one man that wasn't dressed. And he said to him, friend, how did you come in here with white wedding clothes? And the man was speechless. He wasn't dressed, right? He was found naked, so to speak. And the king said, bind him and hand him foot and throw him to outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. And that's the interesting end of this, because many are called, but few are chosen. But the idea here was that he rejected that by not being clothed properly. He rejected the kingdom, and because of that, he would be handed out into this outer darkness. Weeping and gnashing of teeth. Isn't that an interesting concept in the Bible? Gnashing teeth. I always found that kind of fascinating myself. But this idea of him not being ready, him not being prepared, it really brings a lot into this story about the idea that even those that are called later, if they're not prepared, they're not going to get that either. So it's not open to every person. It's open to those who are obedient to what God wants them to be. So there's obedience required in this. Even though the feast was free, the food was free, the invitation was free, was all free, right? But if he didn't do what was required, then he was going to be kicked out of that, wasn't going to be allowed to be part of that. So as Christians, as people of the kingdom, you know, we have to understand that there are requirements to be in this feast, in this kingdom. So a really powerful parable, especially to those people who were there, who were Jews. Really powerful parable. Matthew 23. You know what Matthew 23? You know what we call that chapter of the Bible, Matthew 23? It's the 7 woes. Actually, there's 8. But one of them is a textual variant. So it's the 7 woes, okay? So it's the 7 woes of Matthew 23. The woes of the Pharisee. Woe to you, woe to you. Right? What does that mean? Woe to you. What does that mean? It's not a word we use a lot, is it? We don't come up to people and say, woe to you. Well, if we did that, we'd be like, oh, I better stop. Like whoa. But it ain't whoa. It's like, woe to you. Right? What does that mean? Misfortune? It's not a word we use much, right? I mean, we probably never use that in our conversation. Big trouble. Beware. Warning, right? Woes are warnings. They're warnings. Beware. Woe to you. Woe, where? Beware. Beware. Woe to you, right? Woe to you. Don't touch that hot skillet, right? Woe to you, right? The idea, beware, danger, warning. That's what woes are. Jesus was warning them. He was saying, woe to you because of your actions, because of how you live, because of what you do. You need to beware. It's going to cost you eternity. It's going to cost you your soul. It's a warning. Jesus spoke to the crowd, and the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. What's the chair of Moses? Does anybody know what that is? The chair of Moses? The Sanhedrin's the Jewish court, right? 70 on the Sanhedrin. And in the court of the Sanhedrin, according to what I read, there was one chair that was left empty. It was the chair of Moses, right? What's significant about the chair of, a court? What's the purpose of a court, of a judicial body? I mean, any judicial body. What's their purpose? To do judgment. Based on what? Based on law. That's what a judge's duty is, to interpret law. Is that right? He's not to write law. He's not to change the law. A judge's duty is to interpret a law and to apply it. That's what a judge does. A judge interprets and applies law. In any society, that law, whatever that might be, that's the purpose of a judge. Now, in the Sanhedrin, that was the Jewish court of law. So it's no different than our court of law. That was a Jewish court of law. But they tried you not for transgressions against the Roman law. They tried you for transgressions against God's law. They were a religious court. So in Judaism, there were a lot of things that God, through Moses, required you to do or not do. And if you got caught in one of those things, either doing or not doing, you could be brought before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court. Now, the Jewish court could try you. They could convict you. If they convicted you, they could excommunicate you from Judaism. They could kick you out of the temple. They could even sentence you to death. Now, we know that that wasn't generally carried out, but we also know that it was, because Stephen got stoned to death in Acts, but we know they wouldn't crucify Jesus because they didn't have the ability to sentence someone to death. But in the religious idea, certain violations of Mosaical law were punishable by death, right? What were some of those? Adultery. Anybody caught in adultery? That was punishable by stoning. Both parties, right? That was punishable by death. Adultery was punishable by death, right? Any other examples? Disobeying parents. Yeah, that's right. Under Mosaical law, to disobey your parents was punishable by death. You could be stoned for disobeying your parents. We hear a lot about this Muslim law, Islam law, this Sharia law, right? It's kind of that same thing. They stone people to death over there for a lot of these things, right? Right now, people are being stoned for breaking a religious law. Well, this is what the Sanhedrin did. You brought them before there. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses according to the law of Moses. You couldn't do it with one witness. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses. They brought them before the Jewish court, and the Jewish court tried them. It's what's going to happen to Paul in the book of Acts. They bring him before the Sanhedrin. But the Sanhedrin is scribes and Pharisees. Okay? It's Pharisees and Sadducees, mostly Sadducees on the Sanhedrin. But when they brought Paul before the Sanhedrin, he made them fight because he says, I believe in the resurrection, and that caused them to start fighting, and then they forgot he was there. But this is what these people do. But the chair of Moses is different, because Moses didn't just interpret the law. What did Moses do? He delivered the law. He gave the law. It was the law of Moses, right? They called it the law of Moses. They didn't call it was God's law. Don't make any mistake about it. God's the one who told Moses to bring it, but it was the law of Moses. He brought it, according to the New Testament, he brought it through an intermediary, which was Moses. He brought it through angels and through an intermediary. Moses delivered the law. So Moses, the chair of Moses, was not just the chair that interpreted the law. It was somebody who actually brought the law, who actually gave the law. Jesus accuses these Jews of not just enforcing the law, not just discerning the law. He accuses the Jews of making laws and enforcing laws that they've made. You see? And so he says that you've seated yourself in Moses' chair. In other words, you're not just interpreting the law anymore. You're not just explaining the law. You're not just enforcing the law. You're creating law. You're creating all these laws. And you're trying to make people adhere to these laws that you create. You've become a lawmaker, not just a law enforcer, you see. So there was oral law, a lot of oral law at the time of Jesus. it had blossomed over the centuries, right? Blossomed over the centuries. It had been added to, and it had been perfected, and it had been refined to the point that when Jesus walked the earth, it was not just about the law of Moses or the law brought down by God. It was about all this oral law and oral tradition that Jews were supposed to uphold in order to be righteous. Some of those oral laws were things like a Sabbath day journey. We read about that in the New Testament. Moses never said how far you could walk on the Sabbath. He just said you can't work on the Sabbath. Sabbath day journey was a man-made law, oral law, little less than a half a mile. Not riding on anything. You could ride on the ground, but you couldn't ride on anything that was permanent. That was oral law, right? That was an oral law, not a Jesus ate corn going through the field. The law of Moses didn't say you couldn't eat on the Sabbath. It said you couldn't do what? You couldn't cook, couldn't prepare. You had to prepare your meal before and eat it during. My oven at my house is a Jewish oven, which I think is quite comical, and I love to talk about it. And it's a Jewish oven, talks to you in Yiddish. No, not really, but my oven at the house, you can put it on a Jewish setting, so the lights won't come on inside of it, and it will heat your food, but it doesn't beep or any of that stuff, and doesn't. So anyway, it's a Jewish oven. So anyway, because you can't cook on the Sabbath, right? And you can't run lights. Anyways, all kinds of things if you're Orthodox Jew. So my oven is supposed to live within the rules of Judaism on the Sabbath. So anyway, and a lot of appliances do that. You can actually buy refrigerators now that have Sabbath settings. That when you open the door, the lights don't come on Saturday. Only on Saturday. I'm not making this up. Trust me. Y'all Google it when you get home. So, there was all these laws, tradition, oral laws that you had to do it. And they burdened people. Wouldn't that be a burden? Can you imagine trying to live, not just under what Moses said, but trying to live under what all these oral laws, and there were hundreds of them. All these oral laws that you had to try to do in order to be, a good Jew, right? That's what Jesus accused them of at the very first, right? He says, do not do according to their deeds as they say things and do not do them. He says they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. Okay, so what are phylacteries in Judaism? They're the little boxes that I should have brought a picture, but if you ever see Orthodox Jews, they have a box on their forehead a lot of times, tied to their forehead. They also have them on their forearms. They bind them with leather cords, and they're a little box, and they contain scripture that's like blessed by a rabbi. There's certain scriptures inside those boxes, and it comes out of Deuteronomy 6, where it says you'll bind them on your forearms, the idea of binding God's law onto your body. And those were called phylacteries, and they made them bigger so they would show up. Now, it's really funny, and you ought to Google this. I guess it's really funny, but you ought to Google this just to see what I'm talking about. Just go to Google Images and Google that, phylacteries, Jewish phylacteries or whatever, and you'll see some of these boxes on their heads are like big boxes, like on their forehead, and when they go in at certain times, they do that. They bind them. Deuteronomy 6 says you shall bind them on your gates. Here, hold on. Let me get it. And I will just tell you here in just a minute. In Deuteronomy 6, it says, you shall listen and be careful to them, that you may go well with you and increase greatly, as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. The Lord your God is one God, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These words I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall repeat them diligently to your sons, and speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk on the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. You shall also tie them as a sign to your hand, and they shall be frontlets on your forehead. That's where that comes from. You shall tie them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So in Jewish houses, traditional Jewish houses, they had this, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but it's like mezuzah, M-U-Z-Z-A-H. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it. They're little boxes that contain God's law. They're blessed by a rabbi. And in traditional Jewish homes, if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, have you ever seen Fiddler on the Roof? Anybody ever seen Fiddler on the Roof? When he leaves his house, remember that? He touches that little box on the, if you haven't seen Fiddler on the Roof, you need to see Fiddler on the Roof. So in Fiddler on the Roof, whenever he leaves his house, he kisses his hand and he touches it to this box on the doorpost. That's a mezuzah, okay, or mezuzah, however you pronounce it. And they put those, and they're always at an angle, and they're so far down. This is what I mean by law, right? You know, the box has to be so far down from the top, it has to be put on at a certain angle and attached, and it has to be blessed by a rabbi, and they put them on their doorposts of their gates or on their doorposts of their house, and that all comes out of Deuteronomy 6, and that's what he's talking about when he talks about phylacteries. Yeah. Deuteronomy 6. Oh, I don't know, down there a little ways. 11 or 12. Yeah. 8, Deuteronomy 6:8. Well, 6:6 is, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart. It's right after that. So, but that's what he's talking about. And then the tassel of their garment, they had these prayer shawls that you've seen that they wear, and they've got tassels on them, and they would make them longer. And Jesus is critical of them for doing these things because he says you're doing it so that people will see you. You do it for show, not because you really do what God says, but it's a show. But that's what he's talking about here. That's what these are. So if you want to Google that, you can Google that and you can see exactly what he's talking about, because they still do this today. In Orthodox Judaism, they still do these same things today. Actually, I thought the little box of God's law on your doorpost was kind of cool. I've almost ordered one of them a few times, just because I kind of think that's kind of a cool thing. But anyway, that's why they do that, how they do that. Now, I think Deuteronomy 6, that's another part. I think, interestingly, I don't know that was meant to be taken literally. I think that's a passage that God put on there, like you should always have my word in front of you. It should always be in your house. It should always be in your mind. He said, I'm going to put it in your heart, right? You shall wear it on your forehead, bind it on your hand. I don't really know that God ever wrote that, so he physically would do that. I really think it was more the idea of a mental, spiritual picture of the idea you should always have God's word on you, in you, around you. But, once again, we take something like that, we make it really literal, and then we make it literal, we start doing it, but then we not only do it, then we start saying you have to do it, and then we say you have to do it, but then you got to do it bigger. So I think it's one of those things that just got out of hand, because that's what we do with things. We got to make it get out of hand. So he says you love the place of honor, right? Chief seats, respectful greetings, and being called rabbi by men. Do you know what the word rabbi means? I mean, we always say teacher, but it's way more powerful than that. The word rabbi it's a Hebrew word that's been brought into Greek and Aramaic, and the word doesn't change a whole lot. The word, it means my master or my beloved teacher. I mean, it's a really strong word. It's not just like saying teacher. It's a very respectful title. it's like my master. It's like my teacher. It's very my beloved teacher. It's my masterful teacher, if you get the idea. It's a very endearing term. It's not just like saying teacher. It's like saying my beloved teacher or my master. You know, it's a very empowering, it's a very big term in Judaism. So to call somebody rabbi is it's really a big thing. It's a very powerful word. And it's interesting because there's a different word for teacher. If you notice, you may do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher. Two different words, you see. Rabbi is a different, it's a different, I don't know how to say it. It's a deeper meaning than just teacher to be a rabbi. It's more respectful. It carries a title of honor. It's not a word that you just threw around. When you called somebody a rabbi, it denoted a certain amount of respect. So that's the reason in 8 you see two different words there. Do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher. Now we know rabbi means teacher, but I'm just trying to tell you it's two different connotations there. For you are all brothers. Right? Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader. What does this mean? Does this mean we can't call anybody father? If you've ever been in Catholicism, they call the priests fathers, right? So a lot's been made about that out of this verse. Can't be called a leader, can't be called do not be called rabbi, but yet people call Jesus rabbi all the time, didn't they? Called him rabbi, teacher. Yeah. So what does this mean? You know what? What is 8 through 10? He's talking about Pharisees. He's talking about they love to be honored. They love to be noticed. They love to be recognized. So what's 8, 9, and 10 have to do with that? Yeah, exactly. It's about the position you place above other people, but not just, and I think this is so important, because he's not just talking about the position we place ourselves other people, because we all know in the world, that's how it is. There's bosses, managers, presidents, whatever. There's, CFOs and CEOs and all kind of whatevers. And, there's all kinds of people that are in power, authority in our lives. We're not talking about the world here. We're talking about in faith here. We're talking about these men who should have been leading by example. Instead of doing that, they were leading by authority. Did I say that right? So if you didn't do what they wanted you to do, what was the recourse? What would they do? If you didn't live the way they wanted you to live religiously, then what would they do to you? They'd put you out. They take you before court, the Sanhedrin. They sat in Moses' chair. They convicted you by laws they made, and they would put you out. Jesus said, but Jesus never led that way, did he? What kind of leader was Jesus? He was a servant leader, right? Jesus led not by telling you what to do. Jesus led by showing you what to do. See how Jesus was critical of them because they didn't lead like that. In the church, leaders are servants, right? Leaders are servants in the church. So Jesus said, don't give these men these titles. If you look at 8, what does he say? You are all brothers, you see? You are all brothers. In other words, religiously speaking, because this isn't a world passage, this is a Judaism passage, right? Religiously speaking, should we have titles? Should we have, you see? We don't have titles. Now you say, oh, Rex, you're lying to me. Because we have elders, we have deacons. That's descriptive, you know. And it's multiple. And it's not, and yes, in a sense, we do have a leader that way. But it's not in the sense of this, because our leaders, according to the Bible, our leaders are servants. They're not taskmasters. They're not people who have that authority. So it's interesting. How do we address people? How do we put a title on somebody? When I see one of our elders, I don't call him by my illustrious elder, my master elder, my master teacher. I don't give him a title. You know what I'm saying? I don't elevate them by title. I don't do that. And we shouldn't do that to one another. We do that religiously, don't we? We do that. We've done it for centuries. We put preachers in pulpits that have, we put robes, vestments, garments, right? We call them by titles, reverend, pastor, illustrious potentate, I don't know. We use all kinds of words, right? And so, you got to be a Ray Stevens fan to get that one, don't you? The illustrious potentate. That's a good one, too. You have to go home and listen to Alibaba Temple of the Shrine by Ray Stevens on YouTube. But anyway, but that's not something that we should do, to elevate ourselves over other people, to give ourselves titles, to lead by maybe I'm using the wrong word, but to lead, more or less to lead by rule or authority instead of by example, because biblically speaking, Christ's example was we led by what we did. And then he says, the greatest shall be your servant. And we see this in the scripture repeatedly. First shall be last. Greatest shall be the least. Least shall be the greatest. We see this consistently in the Bible. Whoever is greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled. And whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So Jesus says you think that to have here is not going to translate to there. In other words, those of you who are the least here will be the greatest in the kingdom. Who's the greatest? Now, take Jesus. You can't use Jesus because that's too easy. I'm not going to give you that one. So you got to set that to the side. So, apart from Jesus, who do you think is the greatest New Testament character? Who do you think is the greatest New Testament character except for Jesus? Who's going to be greatest in heaven? Yeah, who would that be? Now, all the New Testament, all the people in the New Testament, who's the least? Who's the least greatest person? Isn't that a weird term? I have somebody in mind. I just want to know if we're on the same page. In the whole New Testament, who would you think that is? The beggar? Which beggar? Who's it? Does anybody come to your mind in the Bible? There's somebody in my mind in the Bible that's going to be the greatest person in the whole New Testament when I get to heaven. Oh, Lazarus might be up there, but technically he's not actually a New Testament guy because he's still under Judaism. But I'll give you that one. But that's not who I had in mind. But I think it's the widow. I think it's the widow, the one that gave the mite in the temple. To me, she's going to be so glorious in heaven. You know, I just think when we get to heaven, we're just going to know we're going to know her name when we get. I think we're really going to know who she is, because I think in heaven she's going to be one of the greatest people in all of heaven. And you know, I think if you look at people and you think, who do we think? Well, we think Peter, we think John, we think, right? We think Paul, we think all these guys, right? And I'm sure they're going to have a good place, don't get me wrong. But right, no greater faith in all Israel. The centurion, the one who healed his servant, centurion's servant, yeah. No greater faith in all Israel, right? Yeah. Nathaniel, right? Said the fig tree. He says, you believe because you saw that, and you'll see greater things than these, right? Behold, there's the idea, I think, like you said, it's those people in the Bible that you don't see much about, that are on the sidelines, those are going to be the people that are going to be the greatest people in heaven. Not the people with big titles and big names and big things, because great faith is not about any of that. Great faith is not about any of those things, you know? Yeah, maybe Cornelius, right? The Gentile who was faithful to God, who God recognized because of who he was. What about Tabitha, Dorcas, right, in Acts, who did all the great things and was raised from the dead because they brought all those things that she had made for everybody, and everybody lamented over her death because of all the things that she did for everybody else. Those people are going to be great in heaven. That's what Jesus is saying. He says, you who exalt yourself here will be humbled. If you exalt yourself here, you'll be humbled. My granny, I know I talk about her a lot, but my grandmother's mother had cancer. And this is back in the early 1900s. And people back in those days were not very educated. They didn't, and especially her mother, hadn't really been to school, whatever. My grandmother got to go to school. And my grandmother said that and this is kind of a tragic story, but my grandmother said that she could hear her mother screaming from 3 or 4 blocks away when she'd come home from school because she was in so much pain. In those days, they didn't have things to give you for that. But my grandma said she was so proud of herself because she had gone to school. She learned all the states, all 50 states, And so she went home, and she was so proud, and she recited all this to her mother. And then she said, and then her mother quoted back to her the capitals of all the states. And she realized that she had just been put to shame, She realized that even though her mother, who she thought wasn't educated, who she thought, didn't have all that, but she found out that her mother was actually probably much more educated than she was, kind of put her to shame. And I'll think of that story when I read this, because whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, right? And that's kind of what happened to her. She was humbled by the knowledge that her mother had that showed that maybe she wasn't as smart as what she thought that she was, right? So now we get to the woes. There's 8 woes. 14 is a variant. You see the brackets on 14? You see the bracket at the beginning of verse 14 and the end of verse 14 before 15? Okay, 14 is a textual variant. So even though if you read most Bibles, you're going to see 8 woes, it's called the 7 woes because the 14 is a variant. So in 13 is the very beginning of it. Woe to you. So these woes, warning, beware, very stern warning. Because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So the first woe of the Pharisees was that they shut off the kingdom of heaven. Their idea of the kingdom of heaven and you and I idea of the kingdom of heaven is not the same idea. We don't have the same concept. But God did. Jesus did. Jesus knew he was the way. He was the truth. He was the life. Jesus knew that he was the one who was going to let people or allow people to be part of the kingdom. And they were going to crucify him. They were not going to allow him to do those things that he should do. But on the other note, they shut it off because they made it so difficult that people could not get there. They made it so hard that the average person was never going to be able to do everything that they wanted them to do in order to get to heaven. And he says, you don't allow them, not that you hinder them, you don't allow them to do it. You physically stop them from entering the kingdom of heaven because of all these things that you've put in place, and that you won't enter in either because you have made this to the point that it's impossible. It's not possible. Isn't that what the New Testament says? It says it's impossible to keep the whole law. Can't keep it. There's too much. There's too many things. You cannot do it. Regardless of how hard you try, you cannot keep all of this. It's impossible. You shut it off. God never shut it off. God didn't make it where it couldn't be done, but you've made it where it couldn't be done. You've made it impossible. We do that with faith. We turn it and make it to a place that it becomes impossible for people to do and to be who we think they need to do and what they need to do to be members of the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus says, woe to you, you're not going. You know, Jesus says this to them repeatedly. You're not going. Remember where he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no way enter the kingdom of heaven. He says, you look good, you act good, you talk good, you do everything you think you should do, but you're not going to get to heaven because you're wrong in your heart. You're wrong in who you are. You've done this for what you get here, not for what you get there, and there'll be no reward for you when you leave this earth. That's a tragic, tragic statement, isn't it? There'll be no reward for you when you leave this earth. They cut themselves off. They had done something. They had made it to where you couldn't get there. We're about out of time, so we'll talk about 14. 14 is a variant in the text. It's not in the oldest manuscripts. That's why it's bracketed. But there is, we need to kind of talk about that verse a little bit, about devouring widows' houses, what's being said there, why that's being said in 14. So we'll talk about that next week. Thanks for your time.